In 1650, a violent earthquake tore through the city of Cusco, high in the Peruvian Andes. The ground heaved and buckled for what felt like an eternity. When the dust finally settled, the damage was catastrophic. Every single Spanish colonial building in the city had collapsed. Grand cathedrals with their thick mortar walls lay in heaps of rubble. Elegant palaces built by the conquistadors were reduced to piles of broken stone and shattered timber. The proud architecture of the Spanish Empire had crumbled in a matter of seconds. But something remarkable stood untouched. Beneath the wreckage of the colonial church of Santo Domingo, a curved stone wall remained perfectly intact. Not a single block had shifted. Not a crack had appeared. This wall was not Spanish. It was far older. It had been built by a civilization that the conquistadors had spent a century trying to erase, and it would not be the last time these ancient walls outlasted everything the Europeans placed on top of them. Today, we are going to talk about the megalithic builders of Peru, the mysterious civilizations that constructed earthquake-proof citadels out of stones so massive that modern engineers still cannot fully explain how they were moved or shaped. We are going to talk about walls where a razor blade cannot fit between the joints, about fortresses that the Spanish believed could only have been built by giants or demons, and about the growing body of evidence suggesting that the people we call Inca may not have built the most impressive parts of these structures at all. To understand what we are dealing with, you first need to picture the landscape. Peru sits directly on the Pacific Ring of Fire, one of the most seismically violent zones on the planet. The Nazca tectonic plate grinds beneath the South American plate, generating earthquakes that have flattened cities for thousands of years. Building anything permanent in this environment is a challenge. Building something that lasts 500 years without mortar, using stones that weigh more than a loaded freight train, is supposed to be impossible. And yet, that is exactly what stands on the hills above Cusco. The site is called Sacsayhuaman, and it is one of the most astonishing constructions on Earth. It sits at an altitude of 3,700 meters, overlooking the ancient city of Cusco, which was once the capital of the Inca Empire. The complex features 3 enormous, zigzagging walls that stretch for 540 meters across a steep hillside, rising 18 meters high across 3 terraced levels. The stones used in these walls are among the largest ever used in any building in the pre-Columbian Americas. Some weigh over 100 tons, and the biggest stones at the site tip the scales at an estimated 300 tons. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the weight of a fully loaded Boeing 747. And these stones were not simply stacked on top of each other. They were cut into irregular polygonal shapes, each one unique, and then fitted together so precisely that even today you cannot slide a single piece of paper between them. This is not an exaggeration. Engineers and archaeologists have tested it repeatedly. The joints are that tight, and they were achieved without mortar, without iron tools, and without the wheel. The engineering sophistication goes even further. The entire layout of ancient Cusco was designed in the shape of a puma, the sacred animal of Andean cosmology, symbolizing strength and earthly power. The 2 rivers running through the city formed the body. The great central plaza was the heart, and Sacsayhuaman, perched on the hilltop above, was the head. The zigzag walls were not random. They represented the teeth of the puma, snarling northward across the highlands. This was not just a fortress, it was a statement written in stone, visible from every corner of the valley below, a declaration that whoever ruled this hilltop ruled the world. But the precision of the stonework is only half the mystery. The real question that has haunted researchers for centuries is this: who actually built it? The Inca Empire is typically credited with constructing Sacsayhuaman, and there is no doubt that the Inca did extensive work at the site. Spanish chroniclers recorded that during the reign of the Emperor Pachacuti, in the mid-1400s, as many as 20,000 to 30,000 laborers were conscripted to work on the fortress, and the construction continued under his successors for roughly 70 years. But here is where the story gets complicated. When the first Spanish soldiers arrived at Sacsayhuaman in the 1530s, they were stunned by what they saw. Pedro Sancho, one of Francisco Pizarro's own men, wrote in 1534 that neither the stone aqueduct of Segovia, nor the buildings of Hercules, nor the work of the Romans had the dignity of this fortress. The conquistadors simply could not believe that the people they had just conquered were capable of building something this monumental. Many of them concluded it must have been the work of giants or demons. More importantly, the Spanish chronicler Pedro Cieza de León, who traveled extensively through Peru in the 1540s, recorded something even more revealing. He wrote that he asked the native people whether these edifices were built in the time of the Incas, and they laughed at the question. They told him that the structures were made long before the Incas ever reigned, but that they could not say who the builders were. This was not an isolated account. Garcilaso de la Vega, the son of a Spanish conquistador and an Inca princess, noted in his writings that the locals spoke of the builders of these megalithic walls, not as mythical figures, but as historical ones, beings of enormous stature and power, who had walked the earth in an age before living memory. Even some of the Inca themselves reportedly told the Spanish that the massive stone foundations were already there when they arrived. Modern archaeology has started to confirm that these oral traditions were not entirely legend. In 2008, archaeologists excavating the periphery of Sacsayhuaman uncovered the remains of a pre-Inca temple. The discovery proved that the hilltop had been occupied and built upon long before the Inca expanded the site. Surface pottery collections had already suggested that the earliest occupation of the hill dated to around 900 AD, but these new finds pushed the architectural history of the site back even further. The temple showed evidence of religious and ceremonial use, indicating that whoever built it had a sophisticated culture with organized labor and spiritual practices. The temple had been partially destroyed by dynamite blasts in the early 20th century, when the site was used as a stone quarry, a reminder that the destruction of these ancient works did not end with the Spanish. The culture most often associated with these early construction phases is known as the Killke. The Killke occupied the region around Cusco from roughly 900 to 1200 AD, several centuries before the rise of the Inca Empire. Archaeologist Oscar Rodriguez has suggested that the Killke built small sections of Sacsayhuaman during the 12th century, and later excavations have supported this idea. The Killke were not a primitive people. They constructed road systems, canal networks, and agricultural terraces across the region. Their ceremonial center was located at Coricancha, the very same site that the Inca would later transform into their most sacred temple of the sun. This is a crucial detail, because it tells us that the ground the Inca considered the holiest place in their entire empire was already sacred to the Killke centuries before the children of the sun ever claimed it. The Killke expanded their influence across the provinces of Cauca, Urubamba, Ollantaytambo, and beyond, controlling the valley and its resources. But the Killke left no written records. They used quipu, knotted string devices for record-keeping, much like the Inca who came after them, and so much of their history remains hidden beneath centuries of silence. But the Killke were not the only pre-Inca presence in the region. Before them, the powerful Wari Empire, which originated in the Ayacucho Basin, had extended its reach into the Cusco area between roughly 600 and 1000 AD. The Wari built the impressive administrative center of Piquilacta, southeast of Cusco, and they constructed many of the earliest agricultural terraces in the Sacred Valley. When the Wari collapsed around 1000 AD, they left a power vacuum that smaller regional cultures like the Killke filled. The Inca, in turn, absorbed the Killke and all the knowledge, traditions, and infrastructure that came with them, each layer building upon the one before, like geological strata in a cliff face. What makes the Killke attribution controversial is a simple question of scale. The megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman, with their 100-ton blocks and impossible precision, seem dramatically beyond what a regional culture like the Killke should have been able to achieve. Some researchers, including David Hatcher Childress, have argued that Sacsayhuaman may be hundreds or even thousands of years older than the Killke culture, and that the truly massive stonework belongs to an earlier civilization that has been complete. Eli lost to history. This is not mainstream archaeology, but it is a position that gains traction every time a new discovery pushes the timeline back further. The mystery deepens when you travel about 72 kilometers northwest of Cusco to the sacred valley of the Incas and a site called Ollantaytambo. This ancient town, perched at an altitude of nearly 3,000 meters, is home to some of the most breathtaking megalithic stonework in all of South America. The centerpiece of the site is the Temple Hill, and at its summit stands the Wall of the Six Monoliths, 6 enormous slabs of pink granite, each weighing over 50 tons, standing side by side with thin stone spacers placed between them. These spacers were not decorative. They were engineered to absorb seismic shock during earthquakes, allowing the massive slabs to shift slightly and resettle without cracking. A construction technique so effective that modern architects are now studying it for earthquake-resistant days. Inyan. But the truly staggering detail about these monoliths is where they came from. The pink granite was quarried at a site called Cachicata, located on the opposite side of the Urubamba River Valley, roughly 6 kilometers away. To get the stones to Temple Hill, workers had to drag them down a steep mountainside, across a river, through a valley floor, and then up another mountain to their final resting place, all without the wheel, without iron tools, and without any known draft animals capable of pulling such weight. The Inca had llamas, but a llama can carry about 30 kilograms at most. These stones weighed 50,000 kilograms each. Scattered along the route between the quarry and the temple lie dozens of enormous abandoned stone blocks. The locals call them piedras cansadas, which translates to tired stones, as if the rocks themselves gave up on the journey and sat down to rest. These blocks were partially shaped at the quarry and were clearly destined for the temple, but something interrupted the work, and they were left where they fell. Archaeologists have found elaborate roads of clay and gravel constructed beneath some of these abandoned megaliths, and wooden rollers were discovered under at least one of the blocks, evidence that the builders had developed a sophisticated transport infrastructure. But even with roads and rollers, the logistics of moving 50-ton blocks across a river valley and up a mountain remain extraordinarily difficult to explain. What halted the construction is still debated. Likely candidates include the devastating civil war between the Inca princes Huáscar and Atahualpa, the arrival of the Spanish, or both. But there is another theory that has gained attention in recent years. Some researchers have pointed out striking similarities between the stonework at Ollantaytambo and the megalithic ruins of Tiwanaku and Puma Punku in Bolivia, over 500 kilometers to the southeast. The architectural historian Jean-Pierre Protzen, who spent decades studying both sites, noted that Ollantaytambo and Tiwanaku share an unusual feature: T-shaped sockets carved into the stone blocks. These sockets are found at both sites and are believed to have held metal clamps that bound the stones together. This is a technique not commonly associated with the Inca, and its presence at both locations raises a provocative question. Did the builders of Ollantaytambo and Tiwanaku share a common architectural tradition, or even belong to the same civilization? Tiwanaku itself is a whole separate enigma. Located on the high altiplano near Lake Titicaca, at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, Tiwanaku was the capital of a powerful pre-Inca civilization that thrived from roughly 300 to 1000 AD. The site features massive stone platforms, carved monoliths, and the famous Gate of the Sun, a 10-ton block of andesite carved from a single piece of rock. But the most baffling part of the Tiwanaku complex is Puma Punku, a cluster of shattered stone blocks that display a level of precision that seems almost mechanical. Perfectly flat surfaces, exact 90-degree angles, and interlocking H-shaped block. that fit together like enormous stone Lego pieces. How a Bronze Age civilization achieved this kind of precision using only stone tools remains one of the great unanswered questions in archaeology. Interestingly, Professor Joseph Davidovits of the Geopolymer Institute has proposed that some of these stones may not have been carved at all, but rather cast in place like a form of ancient concrete. His research suggests that plant-based chemical agents may have been used to dissolve and reconstitute stone into a moldable paste that could be shaped and then hardened. This theory draws support from a persistent local tradition across the Andes that speaks of una sustancia de origen vegetal capaz de ablandar las piedras, a plant substance capable of softening stones. Mainstream archaeology remains skeptical, but Davidovits and his team have conducted laboratory analyses of stone samples from Puma Punku that show unusual compositional signatures consistent with artificial stone. When the Spanish chronicler Pedro Cieza de León visited Tiwanaku in 1549, he asked the local people who built these monuments. They told him the structures were built long before the Inca in a single night by unknown beings. This brings us to one of the most fascinating threads connecting all of these sites, the legend of Viracocha. According to Inca mythology, Viracocha was the supreme creator god who rose from Lake Titicaca during a time of darkness to bring light to the world. But before creating humans, Viracocha first created a race of giants called the Jatun Runa, or Great People. These giants were powerful but arrogant, and they refused to follow the laws that Viracocha had set for them. In punishment, he sent a great flood that wiped them from the earth. Only then did Viracocha create a new race of beings made from smaller stones, and these became humanity. The parallels are hard to ignore. Megalithic walls built from stones so enormous, they seem designed for beings far larger than ordinary humans. Legends of a race of giants who built great works before being destroyed. And a creator god who is described as tall and bearded, arriving from across the water to teach civilization to the people of the Andes. The Spanish chroniclers took these legends seriously, not because they believed in Andean gods, but because the stories seemed to echo the biblical accounts of the Nephilim, the giants mentioned in the book of Genesis. Cieza de León himself claimed that during his travels, he saw enormous bones that were far too large for an ordinary human, including giant rib bones, skulls, and femurs. Juan de Betanzos, another chronicler, documented tales of giants living in the region before the rise of the Inca Empire. He wrote that the Inca spoke of having driven out these beings, whose remains were occasionally uncovered from the earth. Whether these bones belonged to prehistoric megafauna misidentified as giants or to something else entirely remains an open question. But what is certain is that the people of the Andes maintained a consistent tradition, across cultures and centuries, that someone or something built these megalithic foundations before them. Now, all of this mystery would remain purely academic, if not for a dramatic historical event that proved these ancient walls were more than just impressive to look at. They were functional military fortifications of the highest order. In May of 1536, the Inca Emperor Manco Inca launched a massive rebellion against the Spanish occupation. He gathered an army estimated at over 100,000 warriors and laid siege to Cusco, which was held by a small garrison of fewer than 200 Spaniards and several hundred native allies. During the early stages of the siege, the Inca captured Sacsayhuaman itself, and the Spanish were forced to mount a desperate counterattack to retake it. The battle for Sacsayhuaman was ferocious, and the fortress proved devastatingly effective as a defensive position. Its zigzag walls channeled attackers into narrow kill zones, while defenders rained stones, arrows, and slingshot from above. After the Spanish eventually retook Sacsayhuaman at enormous cost, Manco Inca retreated to Ollantaytambo and fortified it as his new headquarters. In January of 1537, Hernando Pizarro, the brother of the conqueror Francisco Pizarro, led a force of roughly 100 Spanish cavalry and 30,000 native auxiliaries against the Inca position at Ollantaytambo. What followed was one of the most remarkable battles in the history of the Americas. Manco Inca used the ancient stonework to devastating effect. His warriors lined the massive terraces above a plain beside the Urubamba River. As the Spanish cavalry charged, they were met with a torrent of arrows, slingshots, and boulders raining down from the heights. Then Manco Inca unleashed his masterstroke. He ordered the opening of previously prepared water channels that flooded the plain below the fortress. The water rose to the horses' girths, turning the battlefield into a swamp. The Spanish cavalry, the most feared military force in the New World, was rendered useless. The Inca counterattacked, and some of Manco Inca's warriors wielded captured Spanish swords, shields, and armor. Manco Inca himself rode into the fight on a captured Spanish horse. It was the first and only time in the entire conquest of Peru that the Inca defeated the Spanish in open battle. Hernando Pizarro was forced to order a retreat under cover of darkness, and his battered force fled through the valley with the Inca in pursuit. It was a stunning victory, made possible in large part by the ancient walls and water systems that had been built centuries before the Inca ever arrived. But the victory was short-lived. Spanish reinforcements arrived from Chile under Diego de Almagro, and Manco Inca, recognizing that Ollantaytambo was too close to Cusco to hold long-term, retreated deep into the jungle fortress of Vilcabamba, where a small, independent Inca state survived until 1572, when the last Inca emperor, Tupac Amaru, was captured and publicly executed in the main square of Cusco. What happened next to Sacsayhuaman is one of the great cultural tragedies of the colonial era. The Spanish systematically dismantled the fortress, using its precisely cut stones as ready-made building material for their colonial churches, palaces, and homes in Cusco. The three great towers that once crowned the hilltop, known as Muyucmarca, Pacamarca, and Salakmarca, were torn down completely. The Muyucmarca alone had been a massive circular tower with 3 concentric terraces and its own internal water supply system, connected to aqueducts that are still partially visible today. The storehouses, the royal quarters, and the ceremonial buildings were stripped bare. The colonial cathedral that now dominates the main plaza of Cusco was built in part from stones ripped directly from the walls of Sacsayhuaman. Today, only about 40% of the original structure remains, and what survives is primarily the lowest levels of the massive zigzag walls, the stones that were simply too enormous for the Spanish to move. The irony is bitter. The conquistadors destroyed the greatest example of earthquake-proof construction in the Americas to build colonial structures that would later be leveled by the very earthquakes the Inca walls were designed to withstand. Time and again throughout the colonial period, powerful tremors struck the Cusco region, and time and again the Spanish buildings fell while the Inca foundations beneath them held firm. It was as if the stones themselves were making a point. Modern science has only deepened the appreciation for what these ancient builders achieved. Engineers studying the polygonal masonry of Sacsayhuaman have confirmed that the irregular interlocking shapes distribute seismic stress far more effectively than regular rectangular blocks. During an earthquake, the stones do not resist the force rigidly. Instead, they shift and sway with the motion of the earth, and then settle back into their original positions once the shaking stops. Researchers call this the dancing stones phenomenon. It works because the mortarless joints allow each block to move independently, absorbing energy through friction, rather than transferring it as destructive force through rigid connections. It is so effective that a California architecture firm called Emerging Objects has developed 3-dimensional printed building components directly inspired by Inca stonework. Their prototypes have proven stronger than reinforced concrete in seismic tests. 500 years after the last Inca emperor was executed, the engineering principles of his ancestors are being rediscovered and applied to save modern lives. The Cusco Pata research project, led by Carlos Benavente Escobar, has revealed that the Inca were not just intuitively skilled builders. They were active learners who improved their techniques over time. The project found evidence that around 1450, a powerful earthquake struck Machu Picchu, while it was still under construction. The damage was significant enough that it forced the Inca to completely rethink their building methods. They abandoned the older cellular architecture of smaller stones and developed the seismic-resistant trapezoidal structures that we see across the Cusco region today, with giant stone blocks at the base and narrower inward-leaning upper walls. As Benavente put it, they knew how to coexist with diverse geologic dangers like earthquakes, landslides, and avalanches. This was not luck. It was engineering, refined through direct experience with catastrophe. Meanwhile, archaeologist Alexei Vranich has been using cutting-edge three-dimensional scanning technology to re-examine the ruins of Sacsayhuaman from the ground up. His team has combined historical field notes from 19th-century pioneers like Leon Sangrand and Max Ulay with millimeter-precise modern measurements to create detailed digital reconstructions of how the fortress originally looked. Perhaps most intriguingly, his excavations have uncovered 19,000 human teeth at the site. The sheer number suggests that enormous numbers of people were brought to Sacsayhuaman, possibly from across the empire, to work on its construction. DNA and isotope analysis of these teeth could eventually reveal where these workers came from and how the Inca organized their massive labor force. There is one more detail about Ollantaytambo that deserves attention. If you stand in the town and look across the valley at the mountain face of Cerro Pinquiluna, you can see something extraordinary. Carved or naturally formed into the rock face is a massive figure, roughly 140 meters tall, that locals identify as Viracochan, the messenger of Viracocha. The figure appears to be a tall, bearded man carrying a large sack on his shoulders, with what looks like a crown of Inca ruins on his head. Whether this is a deliberate carving, an extraordinary natural formation, or something in between is debated. But for the people of Ollantaytambo, there is no debate. This is the face of the god who brought civilization to the Andes. And perhaps that is the most haunting thing about these sites. In the Peruvian highlands, we have stone walls that have survived 5 centuries of earthquakes without mortar. We have blocks weighing 300 tons, fitted together with a precision that modern machines struggle to replicate. We have oral traditions stretching back before the Inca that speak of builders of extraordinary power who vanished from the earth. We have Spanish chroniclers who arrived expecting to find primitive savages and instead found structures that surpassed anything in Europe. And we have a growing archaeological record that keeps pushing the timeline of construction further and further back into the past, beyond the Inca, beyond the Killke, and into an era we can barely glimpse. The Inca built an extraordinary empire, stretching across 6 modern countries, governing 10 million people with an administrative system that rivaled Rome. They constructed Machu Picchu, carved agricultural terraces into impossibly steep mountainsides, and built a road network spanning 25,000 kilometers across some of the most rugged terrain on the planet. They were not a primitive people by any measure. They were among the most capable engineers and organizers the ancient world ever produced. And yet, even they looked at the megalithic foundations beneath their cities and said, "We did not build this. Someone came before us." The question that still echoes across the high Andes, carried on thin, cold air at 12,000 feet above sea level, is the same one that Pedro Cieza de León asked nearly 500 years ago. If not the Inca, then who? And until we can answer that question, the stones will keep their silence, as they have for centuries, weathering every earthquake, every conquest, and every attempt to tear them down, standing exactly where they were placed by hands we cannot name, in an age we cannot reach.